Okay, so I think we're going to continue talking about the importance of in-group social norms. Again, we owe Jenny a huge thanks for all of her help putting this all together and keeping everyone on track, so we should give her Jenny is starting her second year of graduate school. And it's really been a pleasure to work with her. She's very inspiring and competent dealing with some complex but I think insightful data. So, Jenny.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the role of social norms in support for climate policy. So we've heard a lot today already and a lot of other talks about how there's this attitude consistency problem. So people have beliefs, so they have attitudes, but that doesn't reliably lead to behavior or predict behavior. And we can obviously see that in the case of climate policy because, as we've seen, most people believe in climate change, and yet the US has not implemented a sound, impactful climate policy. So I'm going to provide one explanation for maybe what could cause this belief-behavior gap. There's a lot of social psychology research that points out that attitude and behavior are inconsistent across many situations. So our hypothesis is that one factor that could play into this is social norms. So to orient you a little bit to the theoretical background that we're working from, so there's social identity theory, which says that individuals have me identities and we identities, and which identity you draw from and act in line with and make decisions from depends on the context, and depends on which identity becomes salient in a given context. Climate change obviously is a highly politicized context, as you can see from this picture of Trump tweeting while underwater. And so our theory is that social norms might play a role in support for climate policy because your we identity of your political identity or your political group affiliation might be the most salient or one of the most salient identities in the context of deciding whether to support a climate policy or support a politician who cares about climate change. So to begin to explore this question, we ran a correlational study to look at the relationship between social norms, support for climate policy, and belief in climate change. This was a nationally representative survey from last fall, 2016, before the election, which might be kind of important in understanding these results. It was administered online through ROI Rocket, which is a Denver market research firm, and our total number of subjects was 1,313. So we measured political party through a series of questions that asked people which party they identify with, and if they had no strong political party identity, which one they felt closer to. And then we coded that into a continuous party measure from -3 to 3, where -3 is more Democratic and 3 is more Republican. And then I created the environmental values variable as a composite score from 2 scales. So we had a scale of environmental identity, which is these first 2 items, where participants rated their agreement to the 2 statements, I am an environmentalist and I'm concerned with environmental issues. And then we had them answer the NEP, which is a well-known measure of environmental values with 15 items. And then I combined those 2 into a single scale to represent environmental values. Belief in climate change was measured with agreement to these 4 statements. So climate change is happening, it poses a risk to human health, safety, and prosperity. It's human activity is responsible for climate change, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions will reduce climate change. So these might seem kind of unrelated, and you might think that there's variability in people's level of agreement to these 4 different statements because it's capturing a lot, like whether it's happening and whether humans are causing it and how to fix it, but there's actually quite a high correlation between these 4 items. You can see the alpha is 0.92. And then lastly, our dependent variable was a measure of prioritization of climate policy in comparison to 18 other policy issues. So participants read this question asking them to rate their priorities for the next president and Congress in the coming years, and then they read these 19 policy issues, and they rated whether each one should be a top priority, important, not important, or should not be done in the context of this list of the 19 policy issues. So the dependent variable was then created by looking at participants' answer for the climate change item, which is number 13, in comparison to the other 19 items. And it was a Z-score for those of you who are interested in that level of detail. So to kind of start you off looking at the data, this is a graph you've seen in other presentations today, but to remind you of what it's showing, basically we have belief in climate change on the x-axis and prioritization of climate policy on the y-axis. And the main takeaway from this graph is that there's a whole lot of variability in prioritization of climate policy that's not explained by belief in climate change. So we do have these lines with clear slopes that the more you believe in climate change, the more you prioritize climate policy. However, there's a lot of participants whose answers are not close to those lines. So we're going to look at the question of what else could explain prioritization of climate policy besides personal belief. And also, this graph shows you that we have political party identification on the x and belief in climate change on the y. And you can see again that there's some relationship between party and belief in climate change, but it can't be the only thing to explain it because there's a lot of variability that in belief in climate change not caused by party. So what I did is I ran a structural equation model kind of relating all of these variables to ask the question of, do social norms play a role or in explaining prioritization of climate policy above and beyond party and belief in climate change. And something I forgot to cover earlier when I went over the measures is that for the belief in climate change measure and the prioritization of climate policy, in addition to participants rating it for themselves, they were also asked to rate those measures for the average Republican and the average Democrat. So we got measures of what participants thought their own party believed and the opposite party believed for belief in climate change and prioritization of climate policy. So this is the structural equation model, and I'll walk you through it because it's kind of complicated. But first I'll go through the variables so you understand what we're looking at the relationships between. So here on the left we have environmental values and political party, which, like I said, are just included in the model because we wanted to control for them and we wanted to look at do social norms, explain belief in climate change, and policy prioritization above and beyond values and party. So the next row of variables is belief in climate change. On the top we have in-group belief in climate change, and then personal, and then out-group belief in climate change. So in-group is, if you're a Democrat, it's how much you think other Democrats believe in climate change, and vice versa for Republicans. And then for out-group, it's how much you think the other party believes in climate change. And you can see that these two measures covary negatively. So the more you think your party believes in climate change, the less you think the other party believes in climate change, and vice versa. And then we have the policy prioritization measures, which again covary negatively for the in-group and out-group party variables. And this model does not include social norms as predictors of the outcome variables. So this model does not let in-group and out-group belief in climate change predict personal belief in climate change, and it does not let in-group and out-group policy prioritization predict personal policy prioritization. So in a minute, I'll compare it to a model where they are allowed to predict, and that will let us know how much do social norms make a difference in explaining personal policy prioritization. But here in this model, you can see that policy prioritization for climate policy is explained positively by the higher your environmental values are, the higher your policy prioritization is. The more Democrat you are, the higher it is. And the more you believe in climate change, the higher your personal policy prioritization is. So this is the model where we added the paths that allow the social norm variables to predict the outcome variables. So here we're letting your perceptions of your political in-group and out-group belief in climate change predict your personal belief, and same for policy prioritization. And you can see here that there is an increase in the R squared for personal policy prioritization, which means that we're explaining more of the variance in personal policy prioritization by including these social norms variables as predictors. So you can see that they're, and these are all standardized coefficients, which means they're all between 0 and 1. So you can see that whether you think your in-group believes in climate change is a very strong predictor of whether you believe in climate change, and whether you think your out-group believes in climate change is almost zero, so a very small predictor. And the same can be seen for the policy prioritization variables. We have in-group policy prioritization is a strong predictor relatively of personal policy prioritization, and out-group is a very small predictor. And actually the dotted line represents that that's the only non-significant path in the entire model. And so I want to highlight these just to remind you that at the beginning we started by looking at how much does personal belief in climate change explain policy prioritization. And you can see that that's a predictor at 0.25, but your perception of your in-group party norms is a stronger predictor at 0.32. So that's just an interesting point that social norms in this model seem to be a stronger predictor of personal policy prioritization than your belief in climate change. So here, just to kind of review in this full model what's predicting personal policy prioritization, we have it most strongly predicted by your perception of whether your in-group prioritizes the policy, your personal belief in climate change, and your environmental values. And then it's slightly negatively predicted by party, so Democrats prioritize it slightly more, but that's a pretty small, that negative 0.09 is a pretty small predictor compared to the other ones, which means that social norms is, it makes the effective party almost go away. And just to review the statistics of this test, so the chi-squared comparison test between the two structural equation models showed it was significant, which means that the model fit is significantly improved by allowing the social norm variables to predict belief in climate change and policy prioritization. So in conclusion, this model indicates that social norms play an important role in explaining climate policy. So the next step is to investigate this in an experimental way and see if social norms have a causal impact on support for climate policy. But this line of research points that policymakers and advocates should emphasize bipartisan support for climate policy in order to increase support. So talk up people from both sides of the aisle supporting the policy. And that's all I have. Thanks.
So I thought it was really interesting that your opposite party, whatever, the beliefs weren't negatively correlated with your support, right? So that would suggest that it's not a bad thing. Because earlier, at the beginning of this, we were talking about how, you know, maybe Al Gore supporting or being in favor of supporting climate policy is a bad thing. That'll make people want to move away. Oh, because he supports it or Obama supports it. As a Republican, I don't want to be involved with that. But this data suggests that at least for lay people, you know, not politicians, that isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, it's interesting that overall it's slightly positive, because I think if you separate it by party, which I've looked at, then outgroup is, I think it's positive for Democrats and negative for Republicans. So Democrats support the policy more if they think Republicans do, but Republicans support it less if they think Democrats do. So there's a party difference in that. Yeah.
I can't help but wonder if extremity in your party affiliation might modify it. So if you're really a strong Democrat or a strong Republican, you might get those sort of effects.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good point.
Maybe take one more, one switch.
Okay.
I've been thinking a lot about compromise lately, and and I guess I sort of start to wonder, like, what is policy prioritization really representing here in terms of a really real world outcome, right? And so I guess I wonder about it both in terms of how does it behave with respect to the other things, sort of thinking about other ones, but also how might we think about policies that are not just, should we prioritize climate change, but like, how should we prioritize climate change, and whether there are sort of these partisan effects persist as you get into not just kind of which is almost like something that's closer to policy than an attitude.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I think it's tough to study policy as an outcome because like in your daily life there's not like a specific behavior really that you're striving for or we're striving for people to do. It's a little fuzzier than studying like specific pro-environmental behavior. That's a good point.
Thank you, Jen.